Fungus is one of Magic's oldest creature types, making its debut in Magic's first set with the Creature Types Matter theme, Fallen Empires, which was released in 1994. Fallen Empires is largely considered a failure, but a necessary one that helped them get a better grasp on how to design sets around creature types. Whether you consider it a failure or not, it did establish the Fungus creature type, as well as the fact that they often use counters, interact with the graveyard, and do something related to Saproling tokens. While no fungi from Fallen Empires are on this list, there are several that used these design elements originally introduced back then. While there's never been another set to feature Fungus quite as prominently as Fallen Empires did, it is a creature type we've seen with regularity over the years. In all, there are 67 cards that have the Fungus creature type or make Fungus creature tokens, and in this video we'll look at the 10 that have left the biggest impact on competitive Magic. This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. Use the links in the description to visit their store. Before we get started, here's a quick reminder on how I rank cards in these videos. Cards are awarded 2 points for first tier top 8s like Pro Tours, and 1 point for second tier top 8s like Regional Championships. At number 10, it's Mold Graph Scavenger. For one generic and a green, it's a 0/4, and if you have Delirium, which means you have 4 card types among cards in your graveyard, it's a 3/4. Basically, Mold Graph Scavenger is Tarmogoyf at home. And indeed, the Scavenger's points have all come in Pauper, a format where only commons are legal, and thus Tarmogoyf isn't. It was played in that format's Delirium decks, which could have the Scavenger at 3/4 even in the very early game. However, this is a Fungus that doesn't have any points in several years. At number 9, it's Skull Spore Nexus. This legendary artifact costs 6 generic and 2 green, but it costs X less to cast, where X is the greatest power among creatures you control, and its triggered ability is what gets it on this list, because whenever one or more non-token creatures you control dies, you create a green Fungus dinosaur creature token with base power and toughness each equal to the total power of those creatures. You can also pay 2 generic and tap it to double a creature's power until end of turn. In other words, this gives you a nice token every time one of your creatures dies, and because you can double the power of a creature, you can get an extra large token. The Nexus has seen play in standard decks, generally those with dinosaur stuff going on. These decks can power out high power creatures like Pugnacious Hammerskull, making it much easier for you to play the Nexus early, and Belligerent Yearling can become just as big as the token when it enters. The Nexus has lots of time left in standard, and it has a decent shot at continuing to add to its score, as long as there are cheap high-power creatures in the format. At number 8, it's Molder Hulk. For 7 generic, a black and a green, it's a 6/6 that costs 1 generic less for each creature card in your graveyard, and when it enters, it returns a land from your graveyard to the battlefield. Obviously enough, the idea here is to get lots of creatures into your graveyard so that you can get a huge 6/6 into play way ahead of schedule. It was played in standard Golgari decks that were packing cards like Stitcher Supplier, Glowspore Shaman, and Jade Light Ranger, and you can see how, if you curved out with those, a turn 4 Molder Hulk was pretty easy to pull off. The Molder Hulk doesn't have any top 8 since rotating out of standard, though. At number 7, it's Death Bonnet Sprout. For 1 green mana, you get a 1/1 that mills a card at the beginning of your upkeep, and then if there are 3 or more creature cards in your graveyard, you can transform the Sprout into Death Bonnet Hulk, a 3/3 that lets you exile a card from a graveyard each upkeep, and if a creature card was exiled that way, you put a +1/+1 counter on the Hulk. So if you can pull it off, you end up paying 1 mana for a 3/3 with big upside. You don't need me to tell you that that's a great deal. And because the Sprout helps you mill, there's a pretty good chance you can pull it off. The Sprout's points all came in standard mono-green aggro decks. These were creature-heavy decks that were all about playing below-rate creatures, and that's certainly how the Sprout plays out. It hasn't put up any top 8 since rotating out of standard, though. At number 6, it's Skullcap Snail. For 1 generic and a black, it's a 1/1, and when it enters, target opponent exiles a card from their hand. 2 mana 1/1s that make your opponent discard when they enter almost always see at least some competitive play. Disrupting your opponent's game plan and adding to the board is a pretty big deal. The Snail's points have all come in Pauper Ephemerate decks, which run a number of different ways to rebuy Enter the Battlefield abilities, and obviously if you can Ephemerate your Skullcap Snail twice, your opponent's going to be in a world of hurt. It is important that the Skullcap Snail makes your opponent exile the card instead of discard, because that prevents graveyard shenanigans. It's likely that Skullcap Snail continues to gain points in the future. At number 5, it's Mycoloth. For 3 generic and 2 green, it's a 4/4 with Devour 2, which means that when it enters you can sacrifice any number of creatures, and then Mycoloth enters with twice that many +1/+1 counters on it. In other words, if you sacrifice one thing, this big fungus is a 6/6. While giving up a body for a stats boost isn't always worth it, Mycoloth's other ability makes it more worthwhile, since it spits out a Saproling token for each counter on it during your upkeep. One of the really nice things about Devour is that it can let you sacrifice as much stuff as you want all at once, giving it a pretty high ceiling. Mycoloth's success all came in the extended format in elf decks that would cast Glimpse of Nature and then play a whole bunch of elves who could tap for mana, like Heritage Druid. This usually meant ripping through your entire deck and playing a bunch of elves. While Mycoloth wasn't in the main board, it was part of an important sideboard plan where the deck would move away from trying to combo off, which is how it usually won, like with a Storm card, and instead move towards getting a huge Mycoloth in play and equipping Umezawa's Jite to it or your Saproling tokens. This was a really good strategy in game 2 because people would try to disrupt your combo and suddenly they find that your deck's actually significantly different. However, Mycoloth hasn't put up any top 8 since 2009. At number 4, it's Cankerbloom. For 1 generic and a green, it's a 3/2, and you can pay 1 generic and sacrifice it for one of 3 effects. You can destroy an artifact, you can destroy an enchantment, or you can proliferate. This fungus packs pretty nice stats for a 2-drop and a whole lot of utility. It's always nice to have access to Naturalize while still being able to play a solid 2-drop creature. It's usually played in decks that can take advantage of proliferating sometimes too. For example, it's been played in standard Toxic decks that can use the Bloom for an extra poison counter, and in Pioneer it's played in Gruul aggro decks where it can get Scavenging Ooze or one of your Sagas an extra counter. The Bloom isn't heavily played in either format right now, but I also wouldn't be surprised to see it as part of a green deck in either format, since it brings nice utility at such a low cost. At number 3, it's Mold Shambler. For 3 generic and a green, it's a 3/3, but it has Kicker for 1 generic and a green, and if you pay that additional cost when you cast it, you get to destroy a non-creature permanent when it enters. Kind of like with Cankerbloom, this gives you a creature with some pretty serious utility. The Shambler can hit anything that's not a creature, including lands, so it'll always have something to hit when you kick it. It was mostly a sideboard card in Standard, and it was a standard format where it had lots of targets. Even among lands, you could hit things like Valakut, or creature lands like Celestial Colonnade, both of which were fairly important cards in their respective decks. And there were tons of other juicy targets too, including planeswalkers like Jace the Mind Sculptor. More recently, it's seen a bit of play in Pauper, where it's actually seen main deck play. For a while, Tron decks were a big force in the format, so blowing up an Urza land was pretty sweet. Mold Shambler doesn't have any top 8 since 2020, though. At number 2, it's Swarm Shambler. For 1 green mana, it's a 0/0 that enters with a +1/+1 counter, and whenever a creature you control with a +1/+1 counter on it becomes a target of a spell an opponent controls, you create a 1/1 green insect creature token. You can also pay 1 generic and put a counter on the Shambler. The Shambler counts itself, so if your opponent ever wants to remove it, they have to hand you an insect token when they do, and while the Shambler isn't the most imposing creature at first, it can grow throughout the game while also offering this nice upside anytime one of your other creatures carrying a counter gets targeted by your opponent. The Shambler gained all of its points in standard mono-green aggro decks, where it was just a great 1-drop, especially when played alongside Ranger Class and Stone Coil Serpent. However, since rotating out of standard, the Shambler hasn't top-8'd any events. And at number 1, it's Sowing Mycospawn, which is also the newest card on the list. This Eldrazi fungus costs 3 generic and a green, it's colorless, and it has Kicker for 1 generic and a colorless. When you cast the Mycospawn, you can search up a land and put it onto the battlefield, and if you kicked it, you can also exile a land. While Sowing Mycospawn is from Modern Horizons 3, which means that the only 60-card formats it's legal in are Modern, Legacy, and Vintage, it's already made a big name for itself in Modern and Legacy, and has even seen a bit of play in Vintage. This is because it has the ability to tutor up any land and put it into play untapped. That's a powerful effect in formats that have strong lands, and it's nice that you can blow up opposing problematic lands with it too. In both Modern and Legacy, the Mycospawn is usually played in Eldrazi decks which are reliant on powerful lands like Ugin's Labyrinth and Eldrazi Temple. In that deck, Mycospawn can not only fetch those lands for you, it's a colorless creature, so you can use Eldrazi Temple to cast it. Despite being brand new, Sowing Mycospawn already has a very tight grip on the number 1 spot on the list, and is likely to extend on that lead in the future. So, those are Magic's top 10 fungi. If you want to own any of these cards, check out the description, where you can find a direct Card Kingdom link for each card that appeared in the video. If you want to make sure you catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe, and if you want to catch up on past videos, including many more that look at specific creature types, you should see a playlist on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.